What's up, everybody? Welcome to FranX with your hosts, all three of us. Charles, you got anything good to say before we kick this off?
No, I think we're going to have an awesome live stream here today. So let's go right into that, Nick.
If you haven't before, go join our Facebook private group, the Franchise Growth Mastermind. You can message any of us if you get lost or can't figure out your way over there. But we would love for you to be part of the group as well. Here we go. All right, I'll frame the discussion. Whoever wants to go next can go next. And to all the folks that are watching at home, feel free to add comments or questions to be part of the conversation. Not only do you get to join the conversation, but if you have your face attached to whatever platform you're watching on, we'll put you on the screen. So you get a little bit of free publicity. All right, so the topic today is the secrets to selling just one deal. And I'll say this seems to be a hot topic for everyone, given it's always a hot topic. Like, how do I go about selling a franchise? But I think it's getting even more competitive in today's world because every franchisor is also not only competing against another franchisor, they're competing against all of the brokers. So the broker network is doing a tremendous job of saying who lives out in this world, who has some money, they just don't know what to buy. Let's guide them to the brand that makes sense for them. And then the brands on the consumer side, house deals, organic deals, if they have a really strong consumer product, they're seeing leads come in through their websites that are very specific to their brand. But you can see those are kind of drying up or changing. And so now we're in this weird place for franchise development where we're all still saying, where are my leads? But now it's very complex from a marketplace standpoint because you're competing against brands that look like you, brands in general that are looking for qualified and ready to buy franchise buyers, and all the franchise brokers that want to capture that commission before that candidate gets over to you. So we're going to work through our best advice on how to go sell one deal. Like what will it take? But Brent, you want to give opening statements or your thoughts on state of the union as it relates back to franchise sales right now?
Yeah, I think you have a little more insight into the wider franchise community because you work with a lot more brands and we have a very specific portfolio. So it's hard because we're not seeing any slow by any means across the 30-something brands now that we represent. Nick, you've talked about all the favorable elements in the economy right now and just the overall environment that lead to a really strong franchise growth segment. And we're certainly seeing that. But at the same time, we see a lot of brands that we can't work with and we clearly see why they're struggling to get one or two deals done. And I think, today there's usually 5 major buckets that we cover. When we look at a brand and say, this is how we're going to really get it going. These are the 5 things you absolutely have to do. And we can kind of dive into some of those depending how deep we want to go. But really the 5 things that we go through when we start this conversation with a brand are, did we properly define the franchise, the dream franchise buyer? Most brands skip that step because it's weird and hard and I don't even know. Everybody with a checkbook sounds good to me, but they skip that for that reason. So you got to define the buyer. You got to create the right magnets. This is what you, Charles, talk about all the time in the Why You, Why Now, getting the website, the video, the collateral right, the right magnets. Then you've got to have the right lead generation strategy in place, figuring out which of the channels from portals to SEO to PPC to consultant networks are going to work for that particular buyer. And then 4th, we got to automate and set up a really strong process. And 5th and finally, we got to make sure that we're effective when we're recruiting or selling. When we look at all 5 of those, when we get them dialed in, you can usually sell one and then a lot more, and happy to dive into those today.
Brent, I agree. Like there'll always be identifiers of core foundational items. When I examine this issue from an emerging franchisor standpoint, every brand out there, every emerging franchisor, if you're looking for that one more deal, I promise you it is there. And when you uncover that deal, if you're doing the right things, there's many more to come. There's tremendous opportunity. Where I see the brands getting stuck, where I see emerging brands getting stuck is to your point, Brent, and we'll talk about those 5 factors that you guys focus on. It's usually that we're hunting deals, but we haven't built the right foundation and framework. We're hunting deals, but we may not have the right validation. We're hunting, but we don't understand our brand positioning as an economic opportunity. So there's things that are missing. And I think the biggest frustration for emerging brands, right? Many, I can't tell you how many conversations I'll have is, hey, what does Raintree do? Or can I talk to Brent at Raintree? And my answer to him is, look, you're not going to be able to work with a company like that now. Let's build your foundation. Let's look at the next 12 months as foundation setting. And then we're going to go convert those leads. But I mean, for me, framework wise, today, I'd love to talk about foundation, covering your bases and really understanding your brand positioning. And then I think some other items are, things that you and I talk about, Nick, and I think you've been really great at is taking your unconverted lead flow and turning that into gold, right? And doing something there.
All right. I want to take a step backward. So first, let me recap what Brent said. Who's your dream franchisee? Have you built the right magnets? Do you have the right lead generation? Have you automated the process, and are you effective at recruiting or selling franchises? And then Charles, you're like, all that is good. You can go get that next deal. But, and you said, let's talk about foundation and how do we go back even through some of our old assets? So I think part of I'm gonna say the statement, and then Brent, Charles, you guys go. I think part of the challenge in franchising, I see this far too often, is they'll say, hey, Nick, where are our leads? We're not getting the leads done that we want. And I say, okay, well, let's take a step backwards for a second. We say, are you viable from a business standpoint? And we have to look at your product or service, the landscape, and say, one, do you have a point of differentiation in that? And is it in a sustainable category? Do you have proof of sales that you can actually show a franchisee how you're actually going to help them go figure out who their customer is and get them in the door? Do you have profitability so that you can actually prove that you can actually make money in the business? And then are you building avatars of this great franchisee of people that are willing and interested in scaling the business? And I think this is the biggest challenge when it comes to franchise marketing or franchise sales. And frankly, the broker community almost put a Band-Aid over this because they have become the trusted tour guide into franchising. So even if your brand doesn't have those, they can almost mask some of that and give you a shot to have a buyer come to the table. But if we don't start there and look at the viability of business, and when we get to who is this dream franchisee and do we have the right magnets, we might have all of the things that Brent said, but if you don't have a good business, then you're going to be constantly disappointed or frustrated with the outcomes, which is where Brent's opening statement of, we don't work with as many brands as you do, Nick. And right, because we get all the brands that say, okay, build us everything Brent just talked about, and we build it. And sometimes they haven't done the foundational work to make sure that the elements are in place. And the last thing I'll say is this is a LinkedIn jealousy world that we live in. And so I get it. It's really tough to see people show these flashy growth numbers on LinkedIn, and you compare yourself to them and like, oh man, I'm not growing at the same pace. But if you don't take a step backwards and look at the viability of your business as it aligns apples to apples to the businesses that you're jealous of, then it's almost like take the step backwards. Franchising is still going to be here in 5 years. Take the steps backwards to perfect the foundation so that you can go accelerate into Brent stuff. Brent?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about taking a step back to the very foundations, I love the topic. I wonder if there's brands here that are just starting out, that are new to FranX, and I'm wondering, man, how do I know if I've got everything foundationally correct before I start spending time on websites and collateral and dream buyers and selling processes? And, Charles, I know that you are really proficient at this, but if a brand's sitting there wondering, man, is my unit economics up to scratch? Is the model up to scratch? If a brand does ask you, and I hope a lot of brands do, what do you tell them?
For us, the analysis is always industry, unit economics, founder, leadership team. Industry being, are we in a white space? What's the opportunity there, right? And the example always is, who knew we needed another burger franchise until Five Guys came along, right? So we're looking at that segment, just industry generally. Unit economics, that's the critical factor, Brent. And we have a great chart. I think we've used it on FranX also. We focus extremely in pushing our clients toward really understanding what is the opportunity profile their franchise offering fits in, right? Where are we on the axis of estimated investment, ROI potential? Are we an opportunity for is it a lifestyle business, supplemental income, income replacement, legacy building? And I think taking that analysis brings discipline for emerging franchisors. Because if you're going to say your income replacement, now we need to do the deep dive into the KPIs, getting to the unit economics. The questions are not only gross sales, profitability, cash flow, how do we demonstrate it? How do we help them get there? And if we're just a mobile enrichment business that's sort of a lifestyle supplemental income, it's a completely different unit economic conversation.
I think you're right. And I think unit economics is number one. I don't love to look at what the competition's doing, certainly once one of my businesses is up and running. But I think when you're starting a concept or looking at a franchisor and understanding viability, one of the good hacks that we like to use is you can go to certain state registrations and pull FDDs, and you can see what your competitors list in terms of their profitability, their revenues. More and more brands are doing that these days. Usually you'll get indicators of, are we on par or do we exceed that, or are we under it? And if you're under it, you may need to think about the strategy. If you're on par or exceeding that, then that's a really good sign that you've hit that crucial step in unit economics, and you can tick that off and move on to the next kind of phase in getting going and getting deals done here.
I think selling franchises is the wrong term too today. I think it's about developing franchisees. And unfortunately, the way that commissions work in brokers or internal, it's so built on the actual selling of a franchise deal, which is where you're like, where are my leads? But like we have a client, we did a call with them this morning, tremendous growth. They've sold franchises, no problem. And now the bottleneck is real estate. They can't find enough because the competitive landscape is too high. Therefore, the exclusives on A-tier properties are swallowed up. And so now it's not about like they can award 100 deals, and they've actually perfected. They've taken the time to build out. It's a food concept. The build out is now down to 24 weeks. It was at 26 weeks, and they're shooting to be at 20 at the end of the year, but they can't find the real estate. And so now, like, that's like, if you're really setting the tone, it's not just about selling one more franchise deal. It's about facilitating a deal that is going to get open, that is going to scale. And so therefore, when we start looking at the value of a franchisee, if we took every brand that's listening to it, they're gonna all make them equal. Like, how many deals did you get done last year? I got done 45. How many did you get done? I got done 45. How many did you get done? I got done 45. And then you take version one and you say, but of my 45, 40 signed a multi-unit agreement, and of those 40, 35 are opening up their second location now. And so now you look at the value of the 45, and it's so much richer than maybe the third one, where it's like, I sold 45 deals and they're barely opening. And so that's where, like, I've always felt this about franchising is we look at the same picture, but every picture, if you tilt it on the side, has different layers of paint that goes against it. And it's so hard to have apple to apple comparisons.
Yeah, it is. And we were just talking about this in a meeting, actually. we're all out there, and to your point, guilty on being on LinkedIn on saying franchise sold or another franchise awarded or however we put the terms for it. But what we're poor at and what matters the most important metric are how many existing franchisees are buying additional territory. And we had one brand that sold 100 in the first full year. That was fine, but they had their second and third best years respectively, and we only sold 20% to new franchisees. I think you both know, Nick, you work with the brand too, dog training brand. Last year, it was literally 90% of the franchise sales, and it was a stellar franchise sales year, with simply people buying more territory, and our team just sat back and enjoyed that. And that is, to me, the most important part of franchising. When you see that, everybody wins. The franchisee is obviously doing very well and swallowing up territory. It works for the franchisor. There's less to support, more revenue come in to build even more support, and great for franchise sales and brokers too, who benefit from it as well. And I think you're absolutely right, Nick. It's not about just getting it done and calling it a day. It's, did you put the right franchisee in? Circling back to, did you target the right person on the right channel with the right message? And did you deliver on that as the franchisor? Because if you did, and to Charles's point, if the unit economics are there and you've done all the foundational work, if all of that comes into play, if there's complete synergy there, that's when franchising's at its best. That's when we've all done the job properly.
Guys, can I, from an emerging franchisor perspective, because there'll be some emerging franchisors on the channels and in this and saying like, hey, that's great, guys. I'll worry about the 35 franchisees to open up when I get to the 35 franchisees to open up. And so if I could give an example here, and we could use this as a model. I had a conversation with a client yesterday, and Nick had spoke to them, and Brent, your team knows them. And I will tell you, they are a restaurant concept with far superior unit economics. So their unit economics are really good: food costs, labor costs, gross profit. They're operators. They know how to run the restaurant. They have multiple locations at the corporate level. They've sold a couple of franchise. And their question now is, how do I get to that next level, get that flywheel going in terms of franchise sales? And I think this is an issue for so many emerging franchisors. And the one thing I want to throw out there is, the one thing you shouldn't do is get distracted and jump from vendor to vendor to marketing channel and marketing channel. And my advice for this client was, look, we're going to sell some franchises this year, but let's look at the next 12 months as building the foundation. We have validation. We have great unit economics. My advice was, when we hit the marketing channels, and I actually said this, Brent, I said, let's do the things if Braintree would have taken you on or could right now, let's do the things they would be doing. And you know, outside looking in, it's really refining the brand, right? Our three uniques, transformation we offer. For example, are we selling to investor operators, owner operators? Like, what's that story? What do our numbers show? And like, who are we looking for? Number one. And then two, make ourselves unassailable when we do have these leads. They come to the website and they fall through all these information funnels from their founder's story through a whole host of other things. And I said, to the extent we get deals during the next 12 months, great. But let's go fight the fight and play the game for month 13 and on and reset that foundation. I feel like when I see so many emerging brands, they're stuck. And then when I see them 12 months later and they're not clients, they're still stuck. And so, you know, for you guys, like, what if we're setting a foundation and base, what's the tactical advice you guys are giving right now for those emerging brands?
Well, money is army. And I think that's an important statement to think about. So you take an emerging brand, your investment into the buzz building behind your business is building your army around it. And so part of the challenge an emerging brand faces, let's say they have $50,000 to spend, and they really need to get 2 deals done for this $50,000, versus a bigger brand might have $250,000 to spend, and they need to get 5 deals done or 10 deals done, but that number is so much wider. And so if you look at how much is the value of that buzz, it's hard for an emerging brand to pop in and have impact or value in there. So there
Nick,
are.
can I
Go ahead.
interrupt one thing there? And I agree with that, but also I want to tell every emerging brand out there, you got to get off. Like, you got to move. We can't sit still, right? So we have clients that, Nick, the FranX branding masterclass, right? We have clients that go through that religiously, produce an amazing founder video, work on their content internally, and they're converting their organic contacts, those first 3 or 4 deals. It's taken massive effort. And, it takes that massive effort. But for every brand on here waiting for someone to save them and help them get it, you first have to lift yourself up, is my thought. The second, I agree, you need that capital, build that validation and those stories.
Well, I agree with you. And look, this is not a dig on Brent or Brent's company, but the company that Brent's at now, they've created a proof of scale, faster scale than other companies. And so to an emerging franchisor that sees a brand go into fast lane, well, it's called fast lane for a reason. It takes off. Like it put the infrastructure around it, and they let it go through the broker communities. That creates this false sense of, oh well, I can do this too. And so it almost makes it look easy. And I think, Charles, your term is so important. If you're going to go get a deal, you said it takes massive amounts of work. And I think it's almost like franchisors need to look in the mirror. It's the same thing that you would tell a franchisee. It's like, don't expect to turn the lights on and automatically make money. They say it to the franchisee, but they don't look in the mirror and say, well, wait a second, it's going to take mass amounts of work. And the last thing I'll say on that is franchise brand and your corporate business, you're a multi-business operator. And so sometimes you go and become a franchise and think you just latch that onto your other business. No, it's going to require the same grit and hustle that your core business did too.
Yeah, we talk about it all the time. I think it's well known. It's when you franchise, you're starting an entirely new business. You're in a customer service, in a business coaching segment. You're no longer, to Charles's example before, selling burgers. And I think that that's pretty well known these days. I think that's getting better. But I think the big one is to stop comparing yourself to other brands. When we talk about brands with fast-growing FSOs, what people might not understand is I think last year, Kerry and I combined reviewed about 360 applications to join Raintree or Fastlane. And so we're bringing in, like at Raintree, less than 3% of those. Most of them we can't help. And so then to compare yourself to these brands that just have everything in place for an FSO, it doesn't mean it's a good or a bad brand. It means it's primed for an FSO. It's well supported. They're going to do the right thing. They can handle the growth, and franchisees can succeed in doing so. But to compare yourself to them, like anything in life, is a recipe for misery, right?
Yeah, and define success in a different way. Like if you define success based on a jealousy factor, then that's upside down. Like Charles, some of the brands that you talk about, like the power of that founder video or the visionary video, and they may have awarded three deals in the last 24 months, but it's starting to drive a little bit of revenue from royalty. They already have their corporate business. Like that's still winning. I think the problem is, it's like I play basketball every Sunday. I will never be in the NBA. I'm now too old. I dreamt about it, but I still have fun playing sports. Like it's the same mentality. Like you can still be in franchising and maybe not be one of these brands that breaks 100 units, but you can still have a successful impact back to customers and your franchisees.
Look, it's successful emerging franchisors. If I had to pick qualities and characteristics, so they have their house in order, right? We understand our positioning, supplemental income replacement, mobile business, low startup costs, whatever it is, own it. So they understand that. Two, they're exploring the franchise universe. They're on LinkedIn. They come to our mastermind events. They're searching for opportunities. They're having conversations. And then you see them go through a process where they keep calibrating and recalibrating their discovery process, their web media. They keep coming back to the broker conversations and the broker conferences, but they get better every time. And then that brand that looks like the one gaining momentum and an overnight success, there was a lot of foundation setting in the prior 2 years. I mean, and that's the winning formula. I think the frustration is, at least the one I have that I see, is there's not being critical, but there's too much fake, easy information out there that people are led to believe. I just go to a trade show, I'm going to do deals. Now, how many people do I see at a trade show? Great businesses, low startup costs, mobile, but they're not positioned the right way. So you don't even know what they're offering when you're there. And then add on to that, a bunch of events, and so it becomes lost traction.
Jamie said, what does it take to be in the 3% that make it into Braintree Fastline?
Brent, I think they have to be a client of my firm. No.
Man, so there's like a list of 20 things. It's broken up into necessities and niceties. Fastlane have a really solid map for this. I think the biggest thing, it's just to dovetail on what Charles was saying. We used to really go religiously by unit level economics first, validation, all the things you probably can guess. Looking at the segments, is it crowded or is it not? Are they well capitalized? Do they have a background in supporting franchisees? But getting to that point, we've learned in the years, oftentimes it's more about betting on the jockey and not so much the horse anymore. Understanding who's the person or people driving this, that really is the biggest indicator and influencer of how well that brand's going to do. And over our process of anywhere from 2 months to 2 years in talking to brands and trying to figure this out and evaluating it, you really start to understand, does this founder or leader have the same characteristics of some of the other founders that we have that we know are or leaders that are very successful in growing brands the right way? And I think the biggest one that I'm honing in on right now, it's very similar to what you were saying, Charles, is accountability. When I start to hear leaders or founders talk about, well, this franchisee doesn't get it and this person's not doing it, and yeah, that's usually an indicator that they don't quite get franchisee first and what it means to actually support and have franchisees be successful after. But founders really important, leaders really important, unit at level economics, some of the little things. We look for anywhere from 2 to 4 year ROIs. We like to see EBITDA around 20%. We call franchisees. We really start to understand what validation looks like. They're the two biggest buckets. And then there's 18 other little things from there. Big one being, does the founder get it? Do they understand what they're getting into? Do they have the skills and the psyche to do this properly for the long term?
Brent, from an ROI standpoint, sorry, Nick. From an ROI standpoint, and this is for Nick too, what's the benchmark where a brand should be when they're having a conversation about estimated initial investment and how long it takes to recoup and generate ROI?
Is that for Nick?
You said 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, it depends on the initial investment in the segment, right? Like, you're not going to expect a retail food QSR to do a 2-year ROI. Not reasonable, but we have lower investment service concepts that we expect that we see that from. So it depends, but it's a good range.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that this is the challenge, right? So a restaurant brand might have 4 years, which I still think is heavy. Like, my ideal is I'm looking at 3 year, and it's interesting because I could take a restaurant brand and say, you remember when you first started this business, how you bootstrap things? They're like, yeah, I built out a restaurant for $150,000. I go, so why do you have an $800,000 build now? Well, we need all the technology, but you had a great business in the beginning stages. Like, sometimes the numbers get upside down, and I've encouraged brands. Let's say you're upside down. Let's say the payback, if you took every dollar and you put it back into the investment, back against the investment, it took you more than 5 years to pay it off. Well, then my question back to, have you worked through the exercise to say, what would it look like if we could only spend $500,000 on this restaurant? Now, the difference between food and service, though, is food may be able to scale bigger than service. So you buy into Jersey Mike's, early stages, and now you have 20 Jersey Mikes versus you bought into Mike's Lawn Care Services and you have 3. It has to align with what you're trying to accomplish from a business standpoint. And then you look at the exit valuation at the end on what could it look like. So I like a 2 to 3 year payback on initial investment as a starting point. But then I go to what is the potential scalability of this concept so that if I choose to build additional wealth through it and I want to have a larger portfolio, can I actually have that with Brand X?
And I think, Nick, the analysis you just walked through, I think so many emerging franchisors don't go through that analysis and reverse engineer, the economic opportunity and how potential franchisee candidates are going to evaluate it. And I think that's a big miss, right? I think for the emerging brands, before you're speaking to a broker or a candidate or focusing on your website, reverse engineer that thought process on ROI, on the economic viability, because I think it's missed opportunity.
And I think when we're talking about foundational work, the foundational work should happen every year, right? So that very example of item 7, we all, the franchisor, my franchisor brand, we just went through this. We looked at the item 7 and saw what it was and thought, hang on, that's really creeping up. What's going on here? And the answer of, well, that's just what our franchisee spent, and that's what we have to put in the FDD. Absolutely true, but that doesn't mean the conversation stops there. It's now time to analyze why they spent that, where we can tighten this up, where we should be spending and where we shouldn't. And that's part of the process that it's good to work with your team, Charles, because they pushed that on the team really well, item 19, item 7 especially. But the foundational work, getting this right, just because you do it once and sell a few franchises and then a lot more in the next year, doesn't mean that you've done that work forever. It should happen every year, all of these things that we're talking about.
All right, so let's bring it home and answer the question. Brent, go first. If you had to sell just one franchise, what would you do to do so?
So, I mean, this could be any franchise. Is it small, new, anything at all? Okay, well, let me look at my vantage point of looking at brands that are stuck and brands that I'm usually looking at. What's the biggest thing of those 5 things, the 5 pillars that we usually run by? The quickest and most effective thing to fix first is usually number 5. What I see, it's the franchise recruitment process. There's just a lot of developers out there right now that, and certainly when I look at franchise brands where the founder is in the sales process, is in the awarding process, oftentimes we'll get in, we'll audit it, and what I'll see is the developer or the founder or the leader just getting on these calls and just spitting features and benefits and just hammering the candidate with why the brand's so great. And I don't think that's very effective, certainly in these days. We liken it to awarding like a doctor is what we call it, right? Like number one thing is you've got to be there to help. You've got to be there to understand that when you're trying to sell this next franchise, that you have to understand why that person's there. If they're not sick like a doctor, they're going to say you're fine, go home. You've got to say no. And the faster the better and faster you get to say no's more frequently, the sooner you'll start to get to yeses. So we look at it like selling like a doctor, like really spending the first number of calls just trying to understand why the patient's there. Asking question, really understanding the symptoms and then understanding if that franchise model, is there really a solution there for them? When you've done that foundational work and you start really trying to help, act more like a doctor than a salesperson, it's downhill and deals tend to flow. So long as you've done the dream buyer exercise right first too. But I would finish with really audit that process. Is really helping people the primary goal, and are you approaching every single sentence and conversation in that spirit and go from there.
Charles?
I would start with if I had a team with my team, if I didn't with myself, I'd sit down for 2 days and have a long conversation with myself and really have the discipline to say, okay, so I probably do this all the time anyway, but by myself, what is my budget over the next 12 months? And what capital do I have to devote to this process? And I don't care, right? So I want to just understand that. 2, no matter my capital, I'm going to decide I am a guerrilla warrior and I am going to tactically outmaneuver what I need to get this one deal. And I'm going to do the deep dive now. I'm going to have a genuine conversation on what am I offering, what is our positioning, and what's really unique about what we're doing. And it doesn't always have to be the widget you're selling or the service you're providing, but it also gets to that story. And then I'm going to identify 3 emerging brands that I want to emulate, maybe a Raintree brand, maybe some other founder that I see gaining traction on LinkedIn, and I'm going to follow everything they do. And I'm going to have the discipline to keep telling that story. And I think the biggest factor is, or advice for all the emerging brands, have faith and confidence you're going to break through. Don't lose your confidence halfway through and start diverting. But I'd be building all the foundational story, because my conversation we have with our clients is great. You went to a broker networking event, and if by any chance they somehow went to your website, what would they say? And what would be memorable?
Okay, I have 2 comments. One, I agree with both of you. I did a podcast with a franchisee of the Brass Tap last week. So why the Brass Tap? Why nothing else? And he has 15 now. Like he's a scaling franchisee, deeply valuable back to their system. He said they were the only ones that seemed to have interest in me. He's like, they returned my call. They reached out to me. They were delicate in the process. They were willing to answer my questions. So I think sometimes call one is overlooked when it could be the most valuable asset that you have. And who's that person that's selling or awarding franchises on your behalf? Are they there? And are they doing it with care and compassion? And the second thing is, if I had to sell just one, I'm getting in front of my customers. When you think about what a customer brings to the table, they don't look at currency just as cash. They look at currency for love of your brand. And that doesn't matter. You could be a lawn care business. You could be a tree cutting business. You could be a painting business. Doesn't matter. You have customers if you've got to this point of franchising. It's been very rare that you've started a business without having customers. And if we think about 1 degree separation, I was in an Uber yesterday, and he was listening to Mike. I said, "Can I make a quick phone call?" He said, "Yeah." And I had a client call. He goes, "Oh, are you in franchising?" "I just bought a franchise." He started telling me his franchise story. 1 degree separated from almost every human because of the depth of franchising is someone that is in franchising. And so when you just ask your customers, say, "Look, I'm franchising my business," or "I've franchised my business," or "I'm trying to grow my business," just ask your customers, "Do you know anybody that I should talk to about this, or that I can talk to about this?" Sometimes just asking for help might get you connected to someone who could actually passionately care about your brand and become a franchisee. And then you get those folks in and they grow and you change their life, and things can take off in a big way. So that's how I'd answer the question. My last final statement is, I guess I'm looking at your guys' doors. I totally missed the door memo. I got to get this same door behind me. Or you guys are in the same office.
Brent and I coordinate doors all the time.
There we have it. Thanks to everybody who watched live. If you're watching this online, we have revamped. That doesn't mean we're not going to revamp it again, but we've revamped FranX to be every other week on Thursdays, same time, as a webinar type format, so that we can get in front of you and get it on your schedules. We would love for you to participate. Saw some great lively conversations happening in the chat. Thanks for all of you are obviously having a great conversation. Join us in 2 weeks. You'll get an email from us if you've been on this. Appreciate you. This is FranX.